You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and we have an interview episode on our hands, listeners. There is a new biography of Agatha Christie making its way into the world in just a few short weeks. It will be here in the beginning of September. And fortunately for you, I have a fascinating conversation with the author of that biography, Lucy Worsley. We had so much to talk about. It was all so interesting. So let's just get right to the interview. What an absolute treat it is to be able to speak with today's guest. You may know Lucy Worsley as a television presenter, particularly if you live in the UK and have enjoyed numerous programs of hers on the topic of history. Honestly, these programs really are too numerous to enumerate right now. I admit I'm intrigued by the Fibs series. British history's biggest fibs, American history's biggest fibs, royal history's biggest fibs. So many fibs. So much time, apparently. In 2019, her BBC One program, Suffragettes with Lucy Worsley, won a BAFTA. And Lucy has accomplished all this not only because she is fun to watch and to listen to, but because she is a historian and a curator. In fact, she is joint chief curator of Historic Royal Palaces, which is a group of royal homes, including Hampton Court. And that means I get to mention the Hampton Court maze right now, if only tangentially, since it has nothing to do with Agatha Christie, though perhaps I shouldn't make that assumption. Maybe it and Hampton Court has everything to do with Agatha Christie. She did name one of her most famous characters, Christopher Wren, after all. Not to embarrass Lucy, but in 2018, she was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire for services to history and heritage. That means that she had one of those fancy investiture ceremonies at Buckingham Palace. I believe hers was performed by Prince Charles, which makes sense given he is a history aficionado. Lucy is also, and most importantly, for purposes of this conversation, an author of many books. Some of them are fiction for young adults set in various historical periods, while others are nonfiction about certain historical eras and or historical figures such as Victoria and Albert, Jane Austen, and most recently, Dame Agatha Christie, in Agatha Christie, An Elusive Woman, which is a new biography that will be published in a few short weeks on the 6th of September in the US and the 8th of September in the UK. We get the edge on you over here by 2 days on the side of the pond. Lucky us. Welcome, Lucy, to the program.
Thank you for having me. And that's a really generous introduction. And I'm so thrilled to be here because I am a listener. I feel like I'm amongst friends here. And honestly, Kemper, anybody who's researching the life of Agatha Christie these days, they listen to your podcast. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Thank you for all the work you've done over the years.
That is a huge compliment, and I really appreciate that I am in any way contributing to the wealth of knowledge, which is ever growing about Agatha Christie. And I think this biography is also going to be a significant contribution. So I'm very excited for listeners to go out and read this, because it's been a while since we've had a new biography of Christie, and it feels like it's time. And that kind of leads me to my first question. I mean, you obviously have a lot going on and a lot of different directions in which you can go when it comes to new projects. So how did you come to do a biography of Agatha Christie? How did this project come about?
Well, I have written previously about Jane Austen. I loved that project. It was one of the books that's meant the most to me previously. I've also written about the history of detective fiction. And obviously, Agatha Christie popped up in that. And you might think it's a bit of a leap from Austen to Christie. But although Austen is, really firmly in the great literary canon today, it took her a long time to get there, actually. And I could see parallels. Both of them weren't entirely straightforward, easygoing. I like difficult women. I can't think why they appeal to me. And both of them were brilliant writers. Both of them broke the boundaries of what was acceptable in their lifetimes for women, I think. So my road to Christie came through Austen.
I mean, it's funny because Catherine and I, my former co-host, we would often talk about the connections between Christie and Austen. And I think the most fundamental one is just that a lot of avid readers love Austen and love Christie. I mean, I think there are actually a lot of us out there who cherish both of those authors in a particular way. And it's less surprising than it actually sounds on its face that I think there are actually connections to be made between the two of them.
You make me happy and scared at the same time, because I think both of these books I've made wonderful friends. There's such a community of enthusiasts, but with that comes responsibility, not to let people down, to do the best job you possibly can with somebody that they really admire.
Absolutely. Well, I'm curious then, how did you first come across Christie yourself?
Well, people are always really disappointed by this. I don't have a brilliant, the first time I read Christie anecdote. And I've come to realize that I don't think I'm that unusual in that, because certainly for a British or an American person, I think to a lot of us, she feels like the wallpaper of life, something that's, part of the establishment, something that's always been there in the background. Certainly every Sunday night with my granny used to watch Suchet adaptations on the television. And then, of course, I was reading the books as well. It was a treat to get out the blue train after one set of exams finished, got it out of the library as a treat to myself, that sort of thing. And I think that she does lurk in plain sight in people's consciousness. People often say, who are the best-selling authors in history? They are Shakespeare, the Bible, and Agatha Christie. And yeah, fine, amazing. But what people don't necessarily be as surprised about as they should do is that unlike Shakespeare and God, Agatha Christie's a woman. And she achieved all of that in a world that was made for men. Her achievement isn't just extraordinary, it's amazingly extraordinary. She was also, and this is what I like about her, a very ordinary human being, I think. Lots of problems, lots of vulnerabilities, lots of fragilities that are very relatable. Well, you know that as well as I do.
That's such a good point that you just made, comparing Christie to God and Shakespeare, because everyone says that, right? It's like the best-selling books of all time, the Bible, the works of Shakespeare, and then Agatha Christie. It's the soundbite that we all use. But first of all, we're not going to get into the authorship of the Bible, but that is obviously a vexed or at least complex question. And certainly the author of the Bible is not very accessible. Or perhaps you might think that the author of the Bible is accessible, to each his own. Again, not going to go there. But Shakespeare also lived at this point 500-600 years ago. Even his authorship is a little bit of a complex question, and one that people argue over to this day. And it strikes me that of those three, Agatha Christie, not only is she a woman, but she's the one who lived in a modern time during which she was amazingly accessible, especially when you compare her to Shakespeare and God, because it was the 20th century. And perhaps that is one of the reasons that she was as elusive as she could possibly be. She still is elusive, I think, for a modern author. But when you compare her to those other mega bestsellers of all time, maybe that quality makes a little bit more sense.
Well, one of the things that's deliciously elusive about her is that she's not even a single person, is she? I mean, her name literally changes as her life goes on. And I also personally think that as her life went on, she became very distinctly two separate people. she became the public face of the author and then the private family woman. And this splitting of the ways all seems to me to come back to, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it, the notorious year of 1926.
You see that as the point of divergence, if you will.
Well, if you had to ask me what's the single most important event of her life, I might actually take you back earlier to the Great War, because the way I see it, until that point, she was on a certain trajectory for a well-off family with inherited wealth, lived in a villa in Torquay family, and, the goal of her life was marriage.
Mm-hmm.
No question ever of her having to work. But it was the war that for her and for many other women turned all of that upside down. As I suspect listeners to this podcast will already know, she started to volunteer in Torquay Hospital, doing responsible work, actually, as a nurse, and began to get feelings of competence and camaraderie and success that led her to think, actually, it's not bad, this being a working woman thing. And from then, she adopted the role of a professional working writer in the 1920s. She gave interviews about her career, her ambition, the things she wanted to achieve. She even, in one really key interview, I think it's a key interview, she actually said, even my 2-year-old daughter does not deter me from my pursuit of crime. Crime, she said, is like drugs. And, even today, women would worry about saying that. They'd worry about being judged. But she was totally committed to her career at that stage. But after 1926, things changed. I feel that her having been a working woman was part of what went wrong for her in 1926. And after that, in her increasingly rare, increasingly guarded interviews, you don't hear her banging on about her career anymore. She sort of reverts to the Edwardian values of her childhood and keeps up this whole shtick about how, my books, I produced them by accident. My main role in life is to be a housewife, a homemaker, a married woman. And those are her Edwardian values speaking, I think, but also a reaction to the sort of public shaming that she got in 1926.
That's so interesting. I think that is absolutely warranted, that analysis. And I've never thought about it bifurcated in that way, but the pre-1926 Christie being a little more open about her career and who she was. People often point to when she and Archie went on that round the world tour, that amazing exhibition tour where she was standing up on a surfboard in Hawaii and having such a lark in South Africa. And, we get to see that in The Man in the Brown Suit, et cetera, that she was very outgoing. And there was even publicity surrounding that. And she seemed to have no problem. I think at one point she even gave a speech, an impromptu speech to people, and that she seemed to have these skills that just vanished. And I think the answer is she wanted them to vanish because she had been so burned, to use a modern phrase, by what happened to her in the disappearance. And it's interesting that she could have presented herself as more of a working wife and mother pre-1926 and then afterward. And of course, the bulk of her career is afterward, right? So that's the Agatha Christie that tends to have survived. I think it's harder. You almost have to dig, as you did, to find those quotes, right? From 1921 or 1923 or the 1922 World Tour or what have you. You really have to dig to find those, because the Agatha Christie that she left for posterity is the self-deprecating one. And it's the one who is steeped in those Edwardian and even Victorian ideals and says, and it's so absurd, because you sit and you look at this person's output, these 66 novels, not all of which are brilliant, but most of which are, and some of which are some of the masterpieces of the 20th century, and certainly of 20th century mysteries. And she pretends that I just sort of toddled off for a few hours, and I guess I typed out a few words, and it's just not true. And that's why I so appreciate all the work John Curran does with those notebooks and painstakingly going through, because that's really the only true record I think we also have beyond what she says. And we just learn very quickly that we can't trust what she says because of this. And you can see how much work and just how much creativity there was going on there, which she did foster even in those later decades. And of course she did. Otherwise, those books would never have existed.
The other interesting resource for looking at this issue of her professionalism is, of course, the archive of her correspondence with her literary agent at Exeter University, where you do see her, not in public, but in private, being professional in the sense of being really quite demanding of the people that she was working with, sometimes quite brusque, definitely somebody who was formidable. But her public image in interviews was this cuddly little grey-haired grandmother. And it makes me sad because unfortunately, a lot of people have taken her at her word. You know, if she talked down her achievements, other people were happy to run with that.
Yep.
And to say, yes, there's something trashy, there's something lowbrow, there's something insignificant about what she has produced. And when I've come to this project, I am riding on this great wave carried out by so many scholars that you and I both admire, like Alison Light and Jamie Berntal and ever so many others who have not taken her at face value and made the case for taking her seriously.
Absolutely. Your reference to her letters, especially to her agent, Edmund Cork, it reminds me, I don't think I've ever actually said this on the podcast, but I do often make reference to Edmund Cork. And I always say longtime agent, Christie's longtime agent, Edmund Cork. And every time I say that, I think in my head, because of the tenor of so many of those letters and long suffering, like long time and long suffering agent. But I never say it aloud because I worry that will come across as critical of Christie or even misogynistic, because I don't want to portray her as the harridan or anything like that, because she's a professional and she had every right to be demanding about her book covers and everything else. But it's a little relentless when you read those letters, and she's just constantly, there's a constant harangue, especially about book covers. It's like, couldn't you ever get the book cover and the dust jacket right? Like they never got it right for Agatha Christie.
You're sort of funny. Skirting around a central problem that I had. I've got a good way through my book, and I began to become very seriously worried that she wasn't likable. I mean, I wanted to make her into a heroine. I wanted people to be on her side, following her through her life. And I spoke to Alison Light, who I've already referenced, an older biographer, somebody who I very much admire. And I was talking to her about it. And she said, and I took her advice, look, you've got to trust your readers to understand the complexity of this woman. She said to me, look, you're not one single person the whole time, are you? There's nothing at the heart of you. There are masks that you wear. There are layers. There's dark, there's shade. There's that in all of us. So let's pay her the respect of treating her as a real human being who sometimes fought and did bad things.
Yep. That's so true. And by the way, I was also reminded as you were talking about sort of the subterfuge, I guess, of Christie in those later years, almost pretending not to write or downplaying her writing. That's another connection in a way to Jane Austen, because I will always remember, I don't know where this was from. It could be apocryphal. I hope that it's actually true. But the idea that in one of her homes that Jane Austen lived in, there was a creaky door.
Creaky door.
Right. Yes. So that when she was writing in the drawing, I don't know if it was a drawing room or if it was a more internal room than that, but she could write and then she would be able to hear just before someone came in that they were coming in and cover up her manuscript. Yeah. Right.
I don't think there's any sort of empirical evidence for that being true. I've examined the door.
Which didn't last. I mean, it didn't last. Yeah. It had been oiled since, 1810.
Fair enough. Fair point. But it sort of rings psychologically true, doesn't it? We know that she was very anxious that people would not know that she was writing. And I spoke to one of Christie's editors, and he used a phrase that illuminated things wonderfully for me. He had been to visit her at Greenway, her country house in later life, where she'd spend the summer and have these sort of lavish country house party type setups. And he said, even with all that going on, she couldn't help indulging herself in a certain amount of work. She would go off and work. Because he was an editor and because he was sort of aware of what she was doing. I think perhaps he was privy to something that other guests to the house weren't, who said, it's amazing. You never see her doing any work at all. She's always playing cricket or reading.
That's so funny. Yeah, indulging herself in work, which is also something, I mean, how, interesting that is also applied to a woman who is doing her work. As you said, people took her up on the downplaying and the dismissive attitude toward her work that perhaps she herself promoted, but they certainly ran with it and still do, still do to this day, though less so. Yeah. I think that is changing.
I also feel she probably didn't have a consistent attitude towards her work herself. I mean, sometimes it clearly was work. It was to fund exciting archaeological expeditions. But at other points in her life, sometimes she gives you a glimpse of something like The 3 Days, when she wrote Absent in the Spring, in a white, hot marathon of creativity, if you like. And we know she says these were important times to her, these writing binges. She felt close to God then.
Yep.
So there were times when work saved her. I certainly feel that after 1926, well, we'll come on to that, I'm sure. But I'm sure that writing as Mary Westmacott was part of the process for her of healing from what had happened to her that year.
It's BritBox time, listeners. Except when is it not BritBox time, really? As I've mentioned before, I've been a subscriber for years now, and not just because of their prodigious Agatha Christie collection or their original content, but because they have so many quality mysteries to choose from. And, I keep mentioning the Father Brown series in passing, but let's give the good father his due and acknowledge that at this point, there have been 9 seasons/series of this show put into existence. That is 100 episodes overall. I was shocked by that number. I had to double check it before running this ad, but it's true, despite the fact that there are only 53 of Chesterton's original short stories. That's how popular and successful this series has become. Did you also know that Father Brown's Moriarty-like nemesis is a master criminal named Hercule Flambeau? And before you start getting all hot and bothered on Dame Agatha's behalf, I should point out that Flambeau predates our dear Belgian detective by 10 years. If anything, Flambeau may have been an inspiration for Poirot. And if that's not a reason to watch this show, I don't know what is. So head on over to BritBox.com. And if you're in the US or Canada, use promo code Agatha for 50% off the first month of your monthly subscription. And trust me, you won't be sorry, though Hercule Flambeau almost definitely will be. I do want to touch on 1926, actually, and I want to do that by way of your title. As a listener of this podcast yourself, you probably already know how much I like to pick apart titles. So I'm going to do the same now to your title, because yours comes from a quotation that you use as an epigraph at the start of the book. And it's a quote from Christie herself, and quite an infamous quote, because it's what she's reported to have said when she was staying at the Harrogate Hydro in the guise of Teresa Neal during her 11-day disappearance. By the way, for anyone who's not familiar with all the details of the disappearance, there is an early podcast episode in which Catherine and I did go through what happened during her disappearance. So you can always go back and refer to that episode if you want a little refresher. But this is the quote. Mrs. Christie is a very elusive person. I cannot be bothered with her. So first off, I've seen the title of your biography include the very in some places and then not include it in others. So I imagine there had to be a decision made about that. And I'd love to delight in the pedantry of that process if you'll indulge me by telling me about it. But more importantly, and I think I know the answer to this, but I just would like to hear your answer. Why did you choose to title this book An Elusive Woman and not Person, as Christie herself says in this quotation?
Very, very good questions. In Britain, it's a very elusive woman. In North America, it's an elusive woman. I was just told that tripped more easily off the North American tongue. So that explains that. I chose to call her a woman because it was important to me that it was a book about being a woman in a man's world. That seemed to be significant. That's the lens through which I view history. And I completely accept that history is a huge tent and there's lots of different versions of the world. That's the one that holds particular meaning for me. There are others that are equally valid. So elusive to me seems the essence of her. And I love the layers of meaning that there are in that quotation. Firstly, it was reported in a newspaper article, so you got the journalist. Secondly, it was supposedly the testimony of another of the guests or patients, as they were called, at the Hydro Hotel. And thirdly, even if she said it, she thought at the time that she was Mrs. Theresa Neal. Right. So there's an awful lot of distance between us and what she may or may not have said in that particular moment that seemed to me appropriate for this assiduously private person, somebody who put a lot of effort into being elusive.
It is perhaps the most Christie-ish of Christie quotes because of all of that distance and the layers of weirdness that are heaped upon that quote. It's a fantastic quote. I cannot believe that it is an elusive woman in the US and a very elusive woman in the UK, because you know how odd I find it, this renaming across the Atlantic.
Different titles.
Tradition. Yes.
Different markets. Yeah.
Because I guess we can't handle the very in the US. I'm thrilled that you actually have a title change between US and UK, because that's in keeping. There's something
curiously satisfying about it too, for exactly the reason that Agatha Christie had the same experience.
That's great. That's great. I could tell that, an elusive woman, I think, is so much more of an appropriate subtitling for your book, because that really does come through. And I have to say, what I really appreciated about this biography is that it's been at least 15 years since a major biography of Christie. The last, I'm thinking of Laura Thompson's, which I believe came out in
I love that book.
It's a fantastic book, but it came out in, I believe, 2007 initially. And I think that it feels like you are coming at not the problem, but just the person of Agatha Christie as someone from our time now here in, the 2020s. And that is quite a different place from even the earlier part of this millennium. And I think you draw a lot of really interesting insights and you make a lot of really interesting observations about Christie that no one else has before. And it feels like it was time for someone else to write about Christie in this way, and in a way that I think no one else has before. So I know that I really appreciated this book and the fact that it exists and that it can now take its place alongside all of the others as, an enhancement. I mean, these biographies by no means cancel each other out. They just add, right? Especially with someone like Christie, who is so hard to know. I think they add to our knowledge of her. And I'm just thrilled that yours is here now.
Well, thank you. I think that people often get the wrong idea about them. They think that history's ploughing a lonely furrow, sitting in an archive, looking for the one piece of paper that's going to change the world. But it isn't. It's a team sport. Mm-hmm. And I very much see myself as a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants, not only Laura Thompson, who has been through that archive, but also Janet Morgan before her. Mm-hmm. And what Laura Thompson does so well is celebrate Christie's work, I feel.
Yes.
So I cannot do that as well as her. I haven't even tried. What I've tried to do is bring a historian's perspective to the party, and in a small way, treat Christie as, yes, an extraordinary genius, but also a sort of a representative member of a group of women going through the same experiences, changes to the divorce laws, entering the marketplace of work, dealing with issues of privacy, and to some extent, celebrity, although she wasn't ordinary in that sense at all. Entering the marriage market, experiencing World War I, experiencing World War II. It's like the whole of the 20th century happened to Agatha Christie.
It's so true. I mean, I think in some ways you could say she is the 20th century. I mean, she both is representative of the 20th century and then in a certain way came to define the 20th century, especially now that we're on the other side of it. And that's so true, Lucy, because I think there is a universality to some of the experiences, the major experiences she had, even though her reactions to them and certainly her output, all of that is singular. and unique. But that's really interesting, I think, to look at Christie as a person who is actually representative of her time. And yes, I mean, I think Laura Thompson, that is a reader's biography of Christie, and yours is very much a historian's. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how you structured the biography, because I think it's extremely interesting what you did. Basically, you broke down Christie's life by decade and then characterized her in a different way for each decade based on where she was in her life, but also where the country, if not the world, was at that time. So, we have Victorian girl for the 1890s, Edwardian debutante for the 1900s, bright young author for the 1920s, wartime worker for the 1940s, and so on. And you really do go through every decade with this historical perspective. Did you always know that that's what you were going to do when you decided to work on this book?
It took me a considerable amount of time before I could see that as a route through the woods that would guide me. And if you just come to Christie's life in isolation, a lot of the things about it seem really weird and strange. But some of those mysteries melt away if you look at the experiences of other women like her. I'll give you an example. I know that you love her autobiography, Kemper.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the whole passage about her time in the hospital in World War I, which treats being a volunteer nurse in World War I in a really kind of upbeat way. It's almost like a social comedy.
Yes.
There's a lot in there about how strict and judgmental and kind of unhelpfully bureaucratic the nurses were in the hospital. But I began to read about the experiences of other debutantes going into war work. And hang on, think of it from the point of view of the professional nurses in the hospital. They'd fought really hard to gain recognition of their profession. They've been at it since the time of Florence Nightingale. They were getting somewhere. Then suddenly all these girls turn up who aren't trained. They've hardly been to school. Agatha Christie has practically no education. And they come swanning in here and they've never followed an order in their life. And you can see it from the nurse's point of view. Yeah, you would tell them what to do and how to do it. So I'm sure that explains Agatha's sort of attitude to the nurses. But also this curiously upbeat tone of her recounting things like experiencing an operation and nearly fainting, and taking a dismembered leg that had been cut off somebody's body down to the hotel furnace to have it burnt, and having a patient after 3 days under her personal care die. These are serious, intense experiences, and that doesn't come across in the way she describes it, I don't think. And that's because I think the job of nurses in the war was twofold. It was to provide practical care, and this is all nurses, not just Christie, but also I think it was to witness the war, the horror of war, the sight of naked men, dirty, wounded, and to absorb that and to go home and to not tell their mamas, to make it safe. And the reason I think the war was a seminal moment for Christie, the writer, is because that's what detective fiction does to death as well, isn't it? It takes the darkness, the violence, the horror of World War I. And then in the 1920s, that experience is sanitized by so-called golden age detective fiction. The violence isn't the point of it. The healing of the trauma of the violence by the detective, by God, if you like, is the point of it. And that, I think, explains why Christie writes about the war in the way that she does. And there's been some fascinating work by the historian Christine Hallett, for example, who's pointed out that everybody understood the trauma experienced by male soldiers. Well, not everybody. It was widely accepted that there was a specific form of trauma called shell shock. Quite a lot of people believed in that, though quite a lot didn't. But it wasn't expected that the nurses would suffer this. And so they were experiencing some of the same trauma, but it had no name, which makes it kind of weirder and worse. And she was telling me about a research project that's been done on the pensions paid to former nurses throughout the 1920s. And sometimes they were claiming money for treatment for neurasthenia, the name that was kind of given then to shell shock. Mm-hmm. So historians even are only just beginning to discover what the impact of the war was on the society of the 1920s. Although it's all there, laid out for you to see in the novels of Agatha Christie, if you know to look for it.
Well, and not just the novels of Agatha Christie. I mean, I think that's so true that, as is so often the case when Christie is writing autobiographically, either in her autobiographical tome that came out after she passed away, or Come Tell Me How You Live, there's that gloss, right? Mm. There's a gloss over not everything, but most things. Mm. But the one area where the gloss was very intentionally taken away was her Mary Westmacott novels.
Yes.
And Giant's Bread by Mary Westmacott has a extremely long and honestly narratively extraneous yet fascinating section all about one of the main characters, Nell, who becomes a nurse during World War I. And so many of these specific incidents line up with her autobiographical reckoning, including taking the limb and burning it in the furnace and fainting and all the rest of it. But the gloss is taken away, and you can feel how hard that work was, how exhausted she was, how lonely she felt, and how she barely got through it. And that's certainly Nell's experience. And there's just no question as you're reading it that Nell's experience is Agatha Christie's experience. And she just wasn't willing to be truthful in her nonfiction accounts, but she was when she was writing those stories and also the mysteries, but in a different way. And you have to read them in a different way, and you have to dig a little bit or think about them, almost approach them from, a sideways perspective or what have you, which is a lot of what Catherine and I have tried to do on this podcast, because I think those stories are there in the mysteries as well. They're more baldly there in the Mary Westmacotts, but I agree with you. She absolutely did. She did preserve those stories and those feelings of her experience in her fiction. And it's so important that they are there.
And the timing of Giant's Bread, I think, is highly significant because it's after 1926. I think it was only what happened in 1926 that enabled her to go there, to tell stories that were deeper and more emotionally true and more revelatory of herself.
I think she had to. I think it was an outlet, right? I mean, the Mary Westmacotts were an emotional outlet. I think the mysteries were, but again, in a different way. Plus, they also were how she earned her bread. but yes, I think it's so key that the Mary Westmacotts are post 1926. And that's the first one. Giant's Bread is the first one, I believe, in 1930.
Is it time to talk about 1926 and
Please.
What I believe happened then and how that might affect her coming to write the Westmacotts? Yes. You're in charge, Kemper. I don't want to hijack your interview.
You're not. I was going to say it's never not time to talk about.
Never not time.
In a way, I never want the disappearance to overwhelm everything else about Agatha Christie, the person, the writer, and her works, but it's so important. So it's always something that I think any reader and fan of Christie has somewhere in the back of his or her head. So yes, I would love to hear, especially after doing this research, after thinking about all of this from a historian's perspective, where do you come out on the disappearance? What do you think happened and what was the significance of it?
Well, I have my own very strong, firmly held belief, which I know you don't entirely share, and that's fine. But
Is it? No, I'm kidding.
I definitely approached the central issue of the disappearance with an open mind, because I have noticed that biographers tend to go one of two ways. The first way is very much rooted in the press accounts of the time, and that is to be skeptical about her motives, to veer towards the viewpoint that the reason she disappeared was on purpose to frame her cheating husband for her murder. And that's a very deeply entrenched narrative that's not just in history books with footnotes, but also in films and in novels. And I have noticed recently a whole rash of novels that go with that, from a feminist place, if you like, saying, well, yeah, she framed him, but the cheating rat deserved it type thing.
Yep. Getting her own back.
Yeah. But I just could not find that in the evidence, neither the evidence of her personal private life as captured in her private letters, in which she was the exuberant, talkative, open person that she wasn't in person because of her shyness. And it also seemed to be really clear that the newspapers were telling the story that they wanted to tell. And it seems to me that part of the problem here was the changing business model of the newspaper industry, because in the early 20s, the papers were trying to go over from a model of selling one paper a week to a man to selling a paper every day to both men and women. So how are they going to hook in these new female readers? Well, with stories by women, the serialized novels of Agatha Christie, and of course her short stories as well.
Yeah.
But also stories about women, prominent women, celebrity women. And Agatha was happy to go with that, giving interviews, talking about her work, acting like a public figure. So when the disappearance happened, you can see the press turning on their former darling, because she doesn't give them the story that they really wanted, which was ideally that she would have been dead.
Right. Yeah.
And less ideally, but acceptably, that she'd been up to something bad. She'd made a lot of people waste a lot of time searching for her, investigating, wasting public funds, trespassing on the goodwill of the public. And then what breaks my heart, really, is that people often say, well, she must have been up to something bad because she never spoke about this for the rest of her life. Well, that's not true. It's almost comically untrue, because in 1928, with her divorce coming up, I feel that she realized that she was in danger of losing her child. There's going to be custody issues here. A judge was going to think, is this a good mother? Does she deserve to have custody of her daughter? She had to do something to speak to that judge, I feel, to try to set the record straight. The strategy of silence for her just hadn't worked. So she gives this interview to the Daily Mail, read by millions. But does anyone take it seriously? No, they don't. And that's because she said something that people didn't want to hear. The story that she had to tell was a difficult story to hear then. It's still a difficult story to hear now, because it's a story about trauma and mental illness. And in it, she spoke about how on the night, she'd experienced suicidal thoughts. This was the climax of a difficult period. She'd been ill for months. That was well attested to after the bereavement with the loss of her mother, betrayal by her husband, the pressure of turning out the next bestseller. She was paying the mortgage on this huge new house they'd bought, Styles, which was her possession. It wasn't the couple that owned it. It was her that owned it. It was her that was paying for it. And under all of that, well, she tells us in her interview, she had the feeling that she wanted her life to end. And then when that attempt was unsuccessful, something shocked her into realizing that she wanted to live, but she couldn't live as Mrs. Christie. That was intolerable to her. So I'm really convinced, I know that you have some doubts about this, that she entered into a very specific mental condition that today, we have a name for it today. Today we call it dissociative fugue. And that in this fugue state, it's all about flight. It comes from the Latin name for flight, fugue. And you take a flight from your identity. You can still do normal things. You can walk to a station. You can catch a train. You can check into a hotel, all things that she did. You can think there's something wrong with me. I need to go to a place associated with health and medicine and healing, like Harrogate was. But she wasn't able to say, I'm Mrs. Agatha Christie. And some part of herself came up with this alternative persona. And the psychiatrist who told me about this state said something that really interested me. He said it's a very rare condition. He's spoken to 2 patients who had it, and both of them were women at midlife, and both of them had had relationship problems. At the time, it was a thing that was part of discourse, because a lot of soldiers had experienced fugue as a result of trauma in World War I. So I think that after she had returned to regular life, she did go for treatment by a psychiatrist, probably, not definitively, but probably by a Harley Street guy called William Brown. He was an expert in cases of fugue, or as it was popularly known, lost memory. And if you take seriously the idea that she was ill and she underwent some sort of psychoanalysis as her treatment, that gives you a different reading of her work from that point onwards, I think. I think you can see the Mary Westmacots as a therapeutic process, something she'd been encouraged to do, perhaps even by William Brown. And you can see the increasingly psychological forensic profiler role that Poirot takes as related to that experience of mental health and healing as well. I think that's my view.
My view is not so far off from yours. I take issue with nothing that you said. I think for me that the level of intentionality that may have been involved in her flight, which we could theorize was next to zero if it was truly a dissociative fugue state, or we could theorize was quite high if this was something that she was doing because she had some sort of sadistic designs on making her, dreaded philandering husband miserable. I don't think it matters because it was obviously coming from a place of mental distress and mental illness even, because I don't think that she would have done any of what she did if she were in her right mind. So call it dissociative fugue, call it a psychotic break, call it whatever you want. I think it's something that was born of great pain. And
we agree.
And she did what she did. And that's not fun, right? And that's the thing. I think so many people approach this disappearance of like, ooh, the Queen of Mystery has her own personal mystery. Let's get to the bottom of it. Well, her personal mystery is nothing like the mysteries she created. And that's the point. That's why she created those mysteries, because they were completely different from the very human tragedy that resulted in that 11-day disappearance. So no. There is no satisfaction to be got from delving into the 11-day disappearance if you are doing so as a mystery reader. There's just not. You're never going to get it. And I think that's what frustrates so many people about it. And they're like, yeah. But what really happened? And it's like, well, that's what happened. We can't read her mind per se. So again, the degree of intentionality, I just don't care. I don't even find it interesting because we know what the ultimate source of it was. And as always, I always turn to the Westmacots, and there's that sequence in Unfinished Portrait when the fictional Agatha basically says to the fictional Archie, well, I'm going to leave then. And he almost mishears it, and they can tell, and it's something that is communicated just in their eyes in the scene, where she realizes, oh, he thought I just meant that I might kill myself. And he would be okay with that.
Yes.
He would find that to be a relief. And I am convinced that happened. I have no evidence for that other than the fact that she was so true to her own experience in those Mary Westmacots. Of course, that is her spin on it. So I would imagine that if Archie Christie were ever allowed to tell his side of things, it would be very different, of course. But I have no doubt that was how she interpreted an interaction. And then that led to what was a suicide or near suicide attempt, and then the subsequent 11 days. And again, how intentional she was about what was happening, the level of consciousness that there might have been in her head as to what her next step was as she boarded the train, as she signed in at the Harrogate Hydro, et cetera, as she danced, and talked to other guests. Sure, we don't know that, but, beside the point. It's not a mystery to be solved because there's no satisfaction we're going to get from solving it. But I'm very convinced by what you say. And I think that our understanding of dissociative fugue has certainly changed a lot since 1926. And I think that's why it's so important to believe her and to at least carefully consider the very words that she did give to the public just 2 years later, which still, I think many people will be surprised to hear that. Wait, she gave an interview and people read it? It's still a surprising fact, isn't it?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? That it feels almost radical to say, she said she was suffering, we should believe her.
Yeah.
But some people who are alive and in the world today would disagree with us on that. They say, no, she was lying.
Yeah.
And there were so many things that counted against her plausibility, her integrity, her gender, her profession, a novelist, someone who makes things up.
Yeah.
And also, I feel as a working mother as well, I feel someone who often gets left out of this whole story is Rosalind. She's not really taken into account in a lot of tellings of the story because, okay, there appears to be something perhaps a bit hands-off about upper to middle class, early 20th century parenting to us. But you can't ignore Rosalind. And for me, the key line in this interview that Agatha gives, explaining her actions for the benefit of the judge, as I see it, is the one where she says, in the afternoon, so this is before she disappears, in the afternoon she was driving along in her car and she saw a pit, a quarry, and she thought of driving into it. And this is the key sentence. She did not do so because she says, I had my daughter in the car with me. She did not do it. She would never put her daughter in harm's way. Yeah. And it was only when she'd taken Rosalind home and left her in the care of responsible adults, there were 3 grown-ups in the house, it was only then that she followed this compulsion to drive the car into the pit, however unsuccessfully that she did that.
Right.
But I think it was all about Rosalind.
Yes. Not only did she protect her by not driving into a pit or, a quarry pit with her daughter, but then once she got her daughter safely home, probably thinking, I'm not the person who should be around my daughter right now.
No, my daughter is not safe in my care. I will absent myself. I will leave her to the very, very likable and admirable Charlotte Fisher, for example, who was Agatha's stalwart secretary / nanny for these years.
And this is all so fraught and so sad. And it's
sad.
It's obviously
it's a whole new level of sadness when you think about the danger that she might lose a daughter that forced her into doing this, what must have been a really painful thing, which is coming out in public and saying, I experienced suicidal thoughts. It's brave, but also something that she must have felt compelled to do under terrible pressure.
And this is why, imagine that instead of giving this as a newspaper interview in 1928, she were putting that on a notes app on Instagram or doing an Instagram story in 2022. It would be received differently. And that's what I mean also by the life of Agatha Christie and what happened to her and what she said and what she did and what she achieved does deserve to be looked at anew in 2022, because we approach these things a little differently than we did even in 2005, certainly than in 1970, and certainly than in 1928. And it's really worthwhile, I think, to reapproach these issues as you do in the book, and this being one of the biggest ones.
We always wear the spectacles of the present day, don't we? All history is written in the present, as they say. And if you look at history through a male gaze, through the perspective of the male police officers and the male journalists who made this into a wonderfully addictive newspaper story at the time, you're going to reach a very different conclusion for mine and yours as people a century later.
Yeah. I'm not in any way a full-on advocate of social media. I honestly find it very hard interacting with social media and using social media. But the idea that when you are on social media as a personality, as a celebrity, you can control your own narrative to a certain extent, or you at least can have a part in it, that is not something that was really available to her, because she was existing in a state where there were journalists and they wrote stories about her, and they, quotes can be twisted, quotes can be put in different contexts, and it was just a different time. And like, as you said, history gets written in that moment. So it's just really interesting to think about all of that. Yeah.
Even today on social media, movements against somebody who'd formerly been a star, they gather momentum, don't they? Mm-hmm. And I think that when that happened to her in 1926, she was also, I don't want to pathologize her position. It is presumptuous of me to say that she was ill, but I do think that she was suffering. She tells us that she was suffering and in pain. So she wasn't in a condition to fight back in any meaningful way.
Agreed. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Is there really any more important possession than our brains, people? Make what you will of the mind-matter divide. A healthy, functioning brain is pretty much a prerequisite for happiness and productivity. Fortunately, there are many ways to support a healthy brain, like crossword puzzles or jigsaw puzzles, or, dare I say, mystery puzzles? I do dare. There's also BetterHelp online therapy. And therapy really is such a key part of so many people's mental health plans. It's something I can say from experience has absolutely helped me. And BetterHelp is a special form of online therapy that offers interaction with a professional via whatever medium you'd like. Video chat, phone call, even live text-only sessions. You don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to, and that is always a great thing. Also, it's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and I'm so happy to say that all of you, dear listeners, will get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Agatha. That's betterhelp.com/Agatha. On a little bit of a lighter note, I wanted to let you know how much I cherish I'll call it homespun wisdom that you provide in regard to Archie Christie when you say that he was, in point of fact, incredibly hot. Here's the full quote. It was only when I examined his photograph in the Christie archives that an essential fact about Archibald Christie struck me that I hadn't gained from anything else I'd read. He was incredibly hot. And he really was. I mean, I talked about this a lot with Gillian Gill, who was another Christie scholar. Who Lucy,
much
by the way,
by us both.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Lucy is the one who connected me with both Gillian Gill and Alison Light, who I've now had on the podcast in months past, and I am so grateful to you for doing that, because these are two scholars who she relied on while she was writing her biography.
Groundbreakers.
Yeah. I mean, just such brilliant insights into Christie so early on. And I'm so grateful I was able to have them on for their own interviews. But I talked a lot about this with Gillian when we spoke, how there was a real sexual attraction between Archie and Agatha, and a real sex drive on Agatha Christie's part that I think you can feel in her work, despite or perhaps because of the fact that she never makes all that big a deal about sex. It's very Miss Marple in that only more performatively modern people bother obsessing over sex so much, whereas those like Christie, who have this social foundation of Victorian and Edwardian mores, they simply have sex and enjoy sex. Do you think that's fair?
Well, people talk about the switcheroo, don't they, between the Victorians fetishizing death and not talking about sex. And now we fetishize sex, so we're just not comfortable at all talking about death.
Oh, I've never heard of that. That's so true. Oh, that's so true. Yes, yes.
And she's very enjoyably sort of comfortable with the idea of physical pleasure, isn't she? As Miss Marple says. Well, okay, this is Miss Marple. Perversion, incest, unnatural vice. She didn't like to talk about them, but she knew that they happened. That's one of my favorite Miss Marple quotations, by the way. Slightly off topic. But to go back to Archie Christie, have you seen Top Gun 2, Maverick?
I haven't seen it yet. I know this is shocking. I know, Lucy.
Yeah. It's a hugely enjoyable film, I think. And he's a pilot. He rides a motorbike. He's pretty devastatingly hot. I think that is Archie Christie in 1912 when he walked into that ballroom.
Mm-hmm. And she just had a hubba moment. They were into each other. They were clearly they were hot for each other.
Yeah. And I also think this is perhaps the beginning of the evidence for her being a rule breaker, because he wasn't the sort of man that she was supposed to marry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he didn't come from a family with inherited wealth. He wasn't quite what her mother would have wanted for her. In fact, her mother was a bit down on him.
And not only that, but, in her autobiography, she talks about all of these prior engagements that she had
very funny.
to family friends, including Reggie Lucy, who she was really engaged to. It was a weird secret engagement that wasn't really known publicly, but she had to break off an engagement to to poor Reggie Lucy,
serious business,
to become engaged to Archie Christie. So yes, I mean, it was an unsafe choice.
He was an unsafe choice.
Yeah.
What I think is funny is the way that she had so many proposals that she became almost casual about breaking them off. My favorite of her dismissals was, look, we've only known each other for 10 days. It's awfully silly of you to go and propose to a girl like that.
Again, dare I bring up Jane Austen? I mean, Austen-esque.
Yes, a breaker of the one known engagement after only one night. And I certainly came to believe that was because Austen could see an alternative career for herself as a writer. She was going to be producing books, not babies.
Right. And which at that point, what a revolutionary idea that was.
Yeah, totally. The woman he did marry ended up giving him 10 children.
Wow. Well, a little bit on that note, actually, one of the interesting things I learned from your book was something I had always suspected, but never actually knew, which is that Agatha Christie provided a lot of the funding for the archaeological exploits of her second husband, Max Mallowan. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about this, because I think it's something that people still don't know a lot about and are surprised to learn.
This was an area of great fascination to me. I fear that in the past, Agatha Christie's interest in archaeology has been treated as a kind of quaint, quirky hobby. Oh, how interesting and exciting. And her journey into West Asia in 1930 to begin this next phase of her life, it does fit into a pattern, actually, of other British women running west in order to find new versions of themselves. So when I read that passage of her autobiography that describes the romance of the East, I feel slightly that we're on well-trodden ground here. But when it comes to the actual archaeological work that she did, you'll often hear it quoted. Her very famous description of, the best bit, the best thing that she did, which was cleaning these numerous, intricate, beautiful, fragile ivories that came out of the ground in Syria in the 50s and which are now in the British Museum. Mm-hmm. And it has been said by other archaeologists, her greatest contribution to 20th century archaeology was cleaning these ivories. And she describes how she had her own little technique of doing it, involving a jar of face cream.
Face cream, right, yeah.
Little tool, little sort of dentist's pokey tool thing. But I just think that's the socially acceptable face of her activities on the dig. Actually, her role was to pay for it.
She funded the whole thing.
She paid for the whole thing. And tracking down the paper trail for that was so intriguing because it hardly existed. It did exist, but it was very, very elusive, as you'd expect, because it wasn't socially acceptable. A breadwinner was not supposed to buy her husband's career. There was one killer paper, really. It was a letter from Edmund Cork from the 50s. And she said, look, because of your tax situation, it'd be much better if you paid Max his salary next year rather than this year. His salary? What? She was giving her husband a salary? I find that really fascinating and interesting. The fact that she did it and the fact that nobody really talked about it. And for his very first independent expedition, there's correspondence in the British Museum where he's looking for funding and he's been to the usual sources and he's got a bit from here and a bit from there. And then he says, it's okay, I've got money. This big donor has stepped forward. But this donor, they want their money back if other money comes in. Who was that? It was his wife. I'm pretty confident that was his wife. So I think that right from the start, her money was central to his professional success. And this is a view of archaeology that goes beyond Agatha Christie. There's a website called Trowel Blazers, for example, which aims to celebrate the contributions of 20th century archaeologists and also people who were female and who didn't have the title of archaeologist, the people who were there as wives, but who were actually excavation assistants, secretaries, nurses, finds recorders. They were there as a layer beneath the archaeologists whose names were on the covers of the books. Archaeology is definitely a group sport. And then on top of them, people are much more anxious to recognize the work of the actual Iraqi or Syrian diggers as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I mean, it's one thing if she were merely financially independent of her husband and supporting herself, or even just supporting their personal lives, right? But this is a real step further than that. Honestly, I mean, and again, not knowing anything personally about Agatha Christie's relationship with her second husband, Max Mallowan, though, it speaks well of him in that he clearly had this passion for archaeology, and it's something that he did share with her because they did these things together. She clearly enjoyed going every year on these digs, and you can feel that in Come Tell Me How You Live, another glossy autobiographical writing that tells us basically nothing. But I think she finally found someone who was at least comfortable enough to allow this financial situation to exist. And who knows how he actually felt about it. We don't know his mind, but they were married for decades. And this is sort of the way it was going to have to be, because Agatha Christie was just simply too hugely successful to be anything other than this immensely rich person who had the ability to do this. It's just interesting that even though we know Christie was, if not the best-selling author of her time, we still, this fact, probably because of all of her efforts, is quite hidden. And it also puts me in mind of all of her complaining about taxes, which is real. I mean, the tax situation with Agatha Christie and then Agatha Christie Limited in the US and the UK, it's just a complete mess. But I wonder if she used that sometimes as a way of, again, being able to pretend in her self-deprecating way of, oh, it's like I'm barely making any money and it's all such a mess and who even knows, because that kept her from seeming like the mega donor person who would be able to fund her husband's entire career, in addition to buying multiple houses and contributing to all sorts of charitable causes, many of which she did anonymously, and all of the rest of it.
I'm sure you're right. She just had a conflicted attitude to money. I mean, I like the way that she was a 20th century woman, in that she was liked earning it, she liked spending it, but she still had a 19th century. She had her girlhood's attitude to what you might call wealth management. She just lacked any sort of financial education, I feel. Just simply, you earn money, you pay tax. She never got that. And it's part of the shtick of not being a professional. It's
just interesting that in her first husband, Archie Christie, was someone who was clearly uncomfortable with all of the money that his
I'm convinced of that. I think the evidence for that is sketchy, but ultimately very persuasive. And another thing that her life does for me is to encapsulate the history of 20th century marriage, actually. If you look at her parents' marriage, it was really sort of stereotypically Victorian. Her dad was out there in the public sphere. Her mum was the heart of the home. And they respected each other's differences, but it was clearly hierarchical. Man at the top, woman at the bottom. And what she wanted was this radical new 20th century conception of marriage, companionate marriage, which ultimately Archie sort of said he'd give, but didn't really. But Max Mallowan did. And it was still quite a radical idea in 1930. And the rest of the world catches up. And it's now, people would talk about marriage as a partnership of evils. As a partnership of equals.
Ooh,
Tommy and Tuppence.
Little Freudian slip there, Lucy. Yes. No, and even it's interesting that you mentioned her parents as sort of the beginning of that model changing, because not only I think Victorian in their social functions once they were married, but an intra-family marriage too, right? I mean, they were family members, which is oh so Victorian, right? Like the idea of cousins marrying and just trying to keep it all in the family. Yeah. And then contrast that with Christie, with all of these suitors and really going out on a limb for Archie and then divorcing him and then finding Max Mallowan. It's, really the revolution all happened, right? Within this one person's existence.
It's one of the ways in which her life breaks with the past and makes her this super modern person.
Well, Lucy, honestly, I could talk to you for hours upon hours upon hours about Agatha Christie, but fortunately, all we need to do, I think, is have listeners turn to your book, and they can spend hours and hours essentially doing that, because that is what you've been working on for the past couple of years. And again, I'm so excited for people to be able to read it for themselves. I would be so remiss if I did not ask you two quick Christie-focused questions before I let you go. The first is, if you have a favorite Agatha Christie novel, what is it?
I'm going to say Murder at the Vicarage. And the reason I've chosen that is not just that it's a lovely, fabulous, wonderful story, but because it's the first novel appearance of Miss Marple, who's absolutely my favourite Christie character, not least because I think you share this view. She comes to stand for Christie herself. So it's the start of that phenomenon. And also, I love the way that Miss Marple in that story is less fluffy than the later Marple. She's actually described in the book as a nasty old cat. There's something of the nasty old cat in me. It should be celebrated that women can be nasty old cats some of the time.
I like to think of myself as a nasty old cat too. So yes, yes, she's much more vinegary and Caroline Shepherd-esque, if you will, from her direct antecedent in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. That answer just warms my heart and precipitates my final question, which was Poirot or Marple. So obviously you are
I'm Team Marple.
Yeah, absolutely lovely. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book. And again, Lucy's book, which is called Agatha Christie, a very elusive woman in the UK and an elusive woman in the US, will be out in just a few short weeks on the 6th of September in the US and the 8th of September in the UK. So an elusive woman on the 6th and a very elusive woman on the 8th. What an interesting conversation that was. I really appreciated being able to talk Christie with a Christie scholar who is also an Austen scholar. That doesn't happen every day. And I also think that that was one of the more in-depth and insightful conversations I've ever had with anyone about Agatha Christie's disappearance, what we are to make of it, what it means, and what its significance might be to Christie, to Christie's work, and to ourselves. I honestly think more than any of the episodes that I have recorded since Catherine's untimely passing, especially the interview episodes that I've done, it is such a shame that Catherine wasn't here because she so would have enjoyed and enhanced so much of that conversation I just had with Lucy. I will be eternally disappointed by the fact that Catherine cannot be a part of conversations like that. But I am still glad that I was able to have the conversation between myself and Lucy. So thank you again to Lucy Worsley. Please do check out her biography. And in my very next episode, I will be joined by a super top secret co-host. Still not going to tell you who it is. I really hope that I'm pulling off an Agatha Christie worthy surprise here. I don't think that many people are going to be able to guess who this co-host is. No one has thus far. A few of you have tried over email, over social media. All have failed thus far. I do realize I'm raising the bar here by characterizing the nature of my reveal as Christie-esque. Perhaps that's a bit much, but as you can probably tell, I'm very excited to bring that final novel episode to you, in which I and my co-host will rank Curtain, Poirot's Last Case. That is the final novel to be reviewed and ranked on this podcast. It will not be the final episode by any stretch. I still have short stories to cover. I still have people to interview. I still have lots to discuss concerning Christie and mystery. So have no fear. I am going nowhere. And I still have every intention of producing bonus Patreon episodes. So if you would like to check out any of those, either the ones that I have done on my own since the passing of Catherine, or the ones that Catherine and I did together for a number of years, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, and that's Patreon. I've provided a link in the notes to this episode. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And if you haven't already done so, please give the podcast a rating and or a review. It really helps me out. I will always be so appreciative of it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.